The gunshots echoed through Deadwood Canyon as Sheriff Mason chased the horse thieves toward the old saloon. But when he kicked down the door, ready for a fight, he found something unexpected. A terrified young woman in a wedding dress, begging him not to send her back. Sheriff Mason Cole had been tracking the Fletcher gang for 3 grueling days across the scorching Arizona desert. His bay stallion Thunder was exhausted, foam gathering around the bit as they pushed through the relentless heat. The sun was a merciless orange orb hanging low behind the red mesa formations when the final shots rang out near Murphy's abandoned saloon, a crumbling relic from the Silver Boom days. The desert heat was unbearable, shimmering in waves that distorted the horizon. Mason's shirt was soaked with sweat, his throat felt like sandpaper despite the water in his canteen. Thunder's breathing was labored, and Mason knew they would both need rest soon, but the tracks were fresh, no more than a few hours old. When Mason finally spurred Thunder forward and kicked open the weathered wooden door of the saloon, Winchester rifle ready and finger on the trigger, the sight that greeted him left him completely stunned. Just inside the doorway, kneeling on the dusty wooden floor amid broken glass and overturned chairs, was a young woman in what had once been a beautiful white wedding dress. The gown was now torn and stained with mud, dirt, and what looked like dried blood. Her long chestnut brown hair had escaped from an elaborate arrangement and now hung in tangled waves around her face. Her green eyes, the color of spring grass after a desert rain, were wide with terror, but when she saw Mason, something else flickered there. Hope. The moment she spotted the sheriff's badge on his vest, her hands flew up and she cried out in a voice hoarse from crying and thirst, "Please, don't take me back to him. I'm begging you. I'd rather die than go back." Mason lowered his weapon, his sharp blue eyes scanning the interior of the abandoned saloon. Dust motes danced in the shafts of golden sunlight that streamed through the broken windows, cobwebs hung like gray curtains from the rafters, and the air smelled of decay and abandonment. There was no sign of the Fletcher gang, no horses tied outside, no fresh tracks, no indication that anyone else had been here recently. Only this mysterious woman in her ruined wedding dress. "Ma'am," Mason said, his voice gentle but cautious as he holstered his rifle, "I'm Sheriff Mason Cole from Silver Creek. I won't hurt you, you have my word. But I need to know, who are you talking about? Who don't you want to go back to?" The woman trembled as she slowly rose to her feet, and Mason couldn't help but notice that despite her disheveled state, she was breathtakingly beautiful. Perhaps 23 or 24 years old, with delicate features that spoke of good breeding, but there was something in her expression, a maturity, a hardness around the edges, that made her seem older than her years. This was a woman who had seen too much, suffered too much. Her wedding dress, though torn and stained, was made of expensive silk and lace. The intricate beadwork on the bodice spoke of wealth and careful craftsmanship. This was not the simple dress of a farmer's daughter, but something that would have cost more money than most families in the territory saw in a year. "I'm running from him," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the whistle of wind through the broken windows. "From Cornelius Blackwood. They forced me to marry him yesterday morning. But I couldn't go through with it. I ran away during the ceremony." At the mention of Blackwood's name, Mason's entire demeanor changed. His jaw tightened, his eyes hardened, and his hand instinctively moved closer to his gun. Cornelius Blackwood was the most powerful and ruthless man in 3 counties. He owned the largest ranch in the territory, over 50,000 acres of prime cattle land, and had his fingers in everything from the local bank to the territorial legislature. Mason had tangled with Blackwood before. The man had tried to buy Mason's badge more than once, offering him enough money to live comfortably for the rest of his life if he would just look the other way when Blackwood's men bent the law. When Mason had refused, Blackwood had tried intimidation, then outright threats. "What's your name, miss?" Mason asked, removing his hat out of respect and revealing hair the color of wheat that had been bleached by years under the desert sun. Elizabeth Morrison," she replied, her voice still shaking. My father owed Mr. Blackwood a great deal of money, gambling debts that he couldn't pay. Mr. Blackwood said he would forgive the debt and let my family keep our small farm if I agreed to become his wife." Mason felt his stomach turn. He had heard similar stories before, but they never got easier to stomach. Blackwood was known for putting small farmers and ranchers into impossible debt situations, then swooping in to claim their land for pennies on the dollar. "How long have you been running?" Mason asked, noting the exhaustion in her face. 2 days, Elizabeth replied, wrapping her arms around herself. "I escaped during the wedding ceremony. The church was packed with people. Mr. Blackwood wanted everyone to see his triumph. I told them I needed a moment to compose myself before we were pronounced husband and wife. I slipped out the back door and just ran." She had grabbed a horse from behind the church, a mare that had been left saddled, while her owner attended the ceremony. Elizabeth had ridden hard for hours, not caring where she was going, only knowing she had to get as far away as possible. When the horse had finally collapsed from exhaustion, she had continued on foot. "I've been hiding in this saloon, because I thought no one would think to look for me here," she continued. "It's been abandoned for so long, and people say it's haunted." "You were right about that," Mason said. "But you should know that Blackwood's men are probably searching everywhere by now." As if summoned by his words, the distant sound of approaching horses reached their ears. Elizabeth's face went deathly pale, and she grabbed Mason's arm with surprising strength. "Oh God, it's them. They've found me." Mason moved quickly to the window, and peered out through a crack in the boards. 5 riders were approaching the saloon at a steady pace, their horses kicking up small clouds of dust. The leader rode a magnificent black stallion that Mason recognized immediately. Jake Murdoch always rode the same horse. Mason recognized the lead rider immediately. Jake Murdoch, Blackwood's foreman and right-hand man. Murdoch was known throughout the territory as one of the fastest guns west of the Mississippi, and he had the kind of dead eyes that spoke of a man who had killed before and would kill again without hesitation. "Is there a back way out of here?" Mason asked quickly. "There is, but they'll have men positioned there too," Elizabeth said, her voice filled with despair. "Mr. Blackwood always plans for everything, he never leaves anything to chance." Mason made a decision that would change the course of both their lives. He turned to face Elizabeth, his blue eyes meeting her green ones with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You'll stay with me," he said firmly. "I'm the law in this territory, and it's my job to protect innocent people. You're under my protection now." "But Mr. Blackwood is so powerful," Elizabeth protested. "He has money, influence, men with guns." "Let me worry about Blackwood," Mason said, checking his weapons. "Right now, I need you to go into that back room and stay hidden. Whatever you hear, don't come out until I call for you." Elizabeth hesitated for a moment, studying Mason's face. She saw determination there, and courage, but also something else, a loneliness that matched her own. This man, this stranger, was willing to risk everything to protect her. "Sheriff Cole," she said softly, "why are you helping me? You don't even know me." Mason paused, and for a moment his carefully controlled facade slipped. Elizabeth caught a glimpse of pain in his eyes, old wounds that had never properly healed. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because, well, everyone deserves a chance at freedom." Without another word, Elizabeth hurried to the back room, and Mason positioned himself near the front door, his hand resting on the grip of his Colt .45. When Jake Murdoch and his 4 men entered the saloon, spurs jangling and leather creaking, they found Mason waiting for them. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Sheriff Cole," Murdoch said, touching the brim of his hat in a mockery of respect. "Mighty strange finding you way out here. This ain't exactly your usual territory." "I was tracking the Fletcher gang," Mason replied calmly. "They stole horses from the Thompson spread. Trail led me here." "Funny thing about that," Murdoch said, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "We ain't seen hide nor hair of the Fletcher boys around these parts, but we are looking for something else. Someone else, you might say." Behind Murdoch, his men had spread out slightly, flanking Mason without appearing to do so. They were all experienced gunfighters. "Mr. Blackwood has lost something precious to him," Murdoch continued. "His bride, pretty little thing, disappeared right from their wedding ceremony yesterday morning. Can you imagine such a thing?" "Can't say I can," Mason replied evenly. "She's young, confused, probably scared out of her mind by now." Murdoch went on. Been out in this heat for 2 days without proper food or water. Could be she's taken shelter somewhere around here. The question hung in the air. Mason could feel the weight of 5 pairs of eyes on him. Like I said, Mason replied, his voice steady as a rock. I haven't seen anyone, just dust and emptiness out here. Murdoch studied him for a long moment, then gestured to his men. Mind if we take a look around? You got a warrant? Mason asked. The question caused a ripple of movement among Murdoch's men. Hands shifted closer to guns. Don't reckon I need one, Murdoch said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. This is a matter of retrieving stolen property. Women aren't property, Mason said flatly. And even if they were, you'd still need a warrant to search anything in my jurisdiction. For several long seconds the two men stared at each other. Finally, Murdoch took a step back. This ain't over, Sheriff. Mr. Blackwood ain't the kind of man to forget a slight. I'll keep that in mind, Mason replied. After the men left, Mason waited a full 10 minutes before calling Elizabeth out of hiding. When she emerged from the back room, her face was wet with tears. I heard everything, she whispered. You could have been killed because of me. Nothing to be sorry for, Mason said. But we need to get you somewhere safe. You can't stay here. Where can I go? Elizabeth asked desperately. I have no family except my father, and he's the one who gave me to Blackwood. I have no friends who would dare cross someone so powerful. Mason wrestled with himself for a moment. You can come to my ranch, he said quietly. It's not much, but it's defensible, and it's outside of town where Blackwood's influence is strongest. I can't, Elizabeth protested. People would talk. An unmarried man and woman, living under the same roof, the scandal would destroy you. My reputation survived my wife's death, Mason said, the words coming out harder than he intended. I think it can survive helping someone in need. Elizabeth looked up at him with surprise. You were married, Sarah, Mason said simply, and Elizabeth could hear the pain in his voice. She died 5 years ago. Complications during childbirth. Lost the baby too. The grief in his voice was unmistakable, and Elizabeth felt her heart go out to this man who was risking so much for a stranger. I'm so sorry, she said softly. Mason shrugged. Life goes on. Point is my house is empty except for me. And it's got thick walls and good lines of sight. You'll be safer there than anywhere else. That evening, Mason and Elizabeth rode toward his ranch. The 20-mile journey passed largely in silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Mason's ranch appeared gradually in the distance, modest but well maintained. The main house was built of adobe and timber, with thick walls and windows positioned defensively. There was a barn, a small corral, and a vegetable garden. It's beautiful, Elizabeth said as they dismounted. Sarah designed most of it, Mason replied. She had a good eye for making things both practical and pleasant. Inside the house, Mason showed Elizabeth to the single bedroom. You take this, he said. I'll sleep on the couch. That night, they sat at the small kitchen table sharing a simple meal. The silence between them was comfortable. Mason, Elizabeth said finally, when you said everyone deserves a chance at freedom, what did you mean? Mason was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup, as if it might contain answers to questions he had never been able to voice. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and far away, as if he were talking about someone else's life. I grew up on a farm in Kansas, he said. My father was a good man at heart, but he had a weakness for cards and whiskey. Lost our farm to a man who held his debts, lost it fair and square according to the law. But that man, he took pleasure in our misery, made us work our own land as hired hands, paid us barely enough to survive. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears as she listened, but she said nothing, sensing that Mason needed to tell this story. When I was 16, I watched my mother die of a fever because we couldn't afford a doctor. Mason continued, his voice becoming even quieter. She laid there for 3 days, burning up with fever, begging for water we didn't have money to buy from the well. The man who owned our debt, had water, had medicine, could have helped. But he said debt was debt, and charity was for churches, not businessmen. Mason paused, lost in the memory of his mother's final days. I swore that day that I'd never let anyone use their power to crush someone weaker if I could help it. He said finally. Became a lawman because I thought I could make a difference. Sometimes I can, sometimes I can't, sometimes I can't, but I keep trying. And Sarah? Elizabeth asked gently, though she wasn't sure she should pry into such personal matters. A small sad smile crossed Mason's weathered face. Met her in Tucson, when I was working as a deputy. She was a school teacher, smartest woman I ever knew, could quote Shakespeare, and calculate a feed bill in her head at the same time. She had this way of seeing the good in everyone, even the worst criminals I brought in. The love in his voice was unmistakable, even after all these years. We had 3 good years together before. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. She wanted children so badly, said the house felt too quiet without little voices filling it up. When she finally got pregnant, she was so happy. We both were. Elizabeth could see the pain in his eyes as he remembered. The birth was difficult. Dr. Henderson did everything he could. But, Mason trailed off, then shook his head as if clearing away cobwebs. Sorry, you don't need to hear all this. I asked, Elizabeth said softly, and I think maybe you needed to tell someone. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Over the next few days, they fell into an easy routine. Mason would ride out to check his small herd of cattle, and tend to ranch business, while Elizabeth kept herself busy with cooking, cleaning, and tending the vegetable garden. She was a hard worker and a good cook, and Mason found himself looking forward to coming home to her warm smile, and the sound of her humming as she worked. The house felt different with Elizabeth in it. Warmer, more alive. For the first time in 5 years, Mason didn't dread the evening hours when he would normally sit alone with his memories and his grief. Elizabeth, for her part, felt safer and more content than she had in months. The constant fear that had plagued her since her father announced her engagement to Blackwood began to fade, replaced by a sense of peace she had never expected to find. But their peaceful interlude couldn't last forever. On the 4th day, Mason returned from town with troubling news. Blackwood's put word out that you're mentally unstable, he told Elizabeth, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. He's claiming that you had some kind of breakdown and ran off in a confused state. He's offering a reward for your safe return. Elizabeth's face went white. Mentally unstable. It's a clever move, Mason admitted grudgingly. Makes you look like a victim who needs help rather than a woman exercising her right to choose. Harder for people to criticize him for pursuing you, if they think he's just trying to help a sick woman. What else is he saying? Mason hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what he had to report. He's also putting it around that we're that you and I are. He struggled to find a polite way to phrase it. Having an affair, Elizabeth finished quietly. Something like that. He's suggesting that I've taken advantage of your confused state for my own purposes. Says I seduced you away from your lawful husband. Elizabeth was quiet for a long time, processing this information. She could see the trap Blackwood was setting a menace. If she stayed with Mason, she would be branded as an adulteress, and Mason would be seen as a corrupt lawman who had abused his position. But if she left, she would be completely vulnerable to Blackwood's power. Finally, she turned to look at Mason, her green eyes serious and determined. What if we were? She asked. What if we were what? Married. Elizabeth said simply. If I were your wife, instead of his bride, he'd have no legal claim on me. Mason stared at her, shocked. Elizabeth, you can't be serious. You barely know me. I know enough, she said firmly. I know you're a good man who risked his life to protect a stranger. I know you treat me with kindness and respect. I know you make me feel safe for the first time in months. But marriage, that's not something to enter into lightly. It would be forever. Elizabeth stood up and moved to the porch railing, staring out at the vast expanse of desert and sky. The sun was setting behind the distant mountains, painting everything in shades of gold and orange. What's the alternative? She asked. Live in hiding for the rest of my life. Eventually, Blackwood will find me. He has too much money, and too many men for me to hide forever. Mason joined her at the railing, struggling with conflicting emotions. The practical part of his mind told him that Elizabeth's proposal made sense. Marriage would give her legal protection that nothing else could provide. But another part of him, the part that still grieved for Sarah, rebelled at the idea of marrying someone he didn't love. If we did this thing, he said slowly, it would be a marriage in name only. I wouldn't expect, that is, you wouldn't have to. I understand, Elizabeth said softly, a business arrangement, protection in exchange for companionship. But even as she said the words, Elizabeth knew they weren't entirely true. Over the past few days, she had found herself watching Mason when he thought she wasn't looking. She admired the gentle way he handled his horses, the patient way he fixed a broken fence post, the quiet dignity with which he carried himself. She was attracted to him in a way she had never been attracted to any man. And the thought of being his wife, even in name only, sent a warm flutter through her stomach. Mason was wrestling with similar feelings. Elizabeth's presence had brought light and life back into his empty house. He found himself smiling more than he had in years, looking forward to their evening conversations, treasuring the sound of her humming as she worked in the garden. The thought of her leaving, of going back to the lonely existence he had known before, was almost unbearable. All right, he said finally. If you're sure, I'll speak to Pastor Williams tomorrow. But Sheriff Mason didn't know that Blackwood wasn't just forcing marriage. He was the territory's most ruthless power broker. And this marriage was about the land war itself. The wedding took place 2 days later in Pastor Williams' parlor, with only the pastor's wife as witness. Elizabeth wore a simple blue dress that had belonged to Sarah, and Mason wore his best suit, the same one he had worn to Sarah's funeral 5 years earlier. The ceremony was brief and businesslike, but when Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Mason felt something shift inside his chest. Elizabeth looked beautiful in the blue dress, and when she smiled at him during the ceremony, he felt his heart skip a beat. You may kiss the bride, the pastor said with a gentle smile. Mason and Elizabeth looked at each other uncertainly. They hadn't discussed this part. Slowly, Mason leaned down and brushed his lips softly against Elizabeth's. It was meant to be a chaste, ceremonial kiss, but the moment their lips touched, both of them felt an electric current run through their bodies. When they broke apart, Elizabeth's cheeks were flushed, and Mason's eyes had darkened. Pastor Williams pretended not to notice the charged atmosphere, and handed them their marriage certificate. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Cole, he said warmly. May God bless your union. As they walked back to their horses, Elizabeth tucked her hand into the crook of Mason's arm. How do you feel? She asked. Like I've just declared war on the most powerful man in the territory, Mason replied honestly. Any regrets? Mason looked down at her, taking in her bright eyes and determined expression. Ask me in a year, he said. They had barely arrived back at the ranch when they spotted a rider approaching at a gallop. It was Tom Bradley, Mason's deputy, and the look on his face suggested bad news. Sheriff, Tom called out as he reined in his lathered horse. Thank God I found you. Blackwood's in town raising hell. He's got half a dozen men with him, and they're looking for trouble. What kind of trouble? Mason asked, helping Elizabeth down from her horse. The shooting kind, Tom replied grimly. Word got out about your marriage somehow. Blackwood's saying you stole his property, and he wants satisfaction. Mason felt Elizabeth's hand tighten on his arm. What exactly did he say? He's called you out, Sheriff. Says you're a thief and a coward, and if you've got any honor left, you'll meet him in the street at sundown. Elizabeth gasped. He's challenging you to a gunfight. Looks that way, Mason said, his voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. You can't, Elizabeth said frantically. It's exactly what he wants. Even if you win, his men will gun you down afterward. She's right, Sheriff, Tom agreed. This has all the makings of a setup. Half the town's turned out to watch, but most of Blackwood's men are positioned around the street. You step out there, you're a dead man. Mason was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he turned to Tom. Ride back to town. Tell Blackwood I'll meet him, but not in the street. Tell him if he wants to settle this like gentlemen,
We'll do it proper. Witness duel. 20 paces. 1 shot each. And if he refuses, then tell everyone in town that Cornelius Blackwood is afraid to face one man in a fair fight. Tom nodded, and spurred his horse back toward town. Mason turned to Elizabeth, who was looking at him with a mixture of fear and admiration. You don't have to do this, Elizabeth said, and live looking over our shoulders. Running would prove I'm a coward. What if he kills you? Mason cupped her face. Then you'll be a widow instead of his wife. Elizabeth threw her arms around him. I couldn't bear to lose you. Not when I've just found you. The duel was set for dawn outside town. As the sun rose, 2 men faced each other across 20 paces. Blackwood was imposing even at 62. Tall, silver-haired, with cold gray eyes. His gun was a fancy nickel-plated Colt with pearl handles. Last chance, Cole. Give me back my bride. She's not your bride. She's my wife. Pastor Williams raised his hand. Turn. Walk 10 paces. Turn and fire on my signal. They began walking. Mason's mind was crystal clear. 1 through 9. 10. Turn and fire. Both men spun. Mason's Colt cleared leather first. Blackwood staggered, clutching his shoulder, his shot going wide. It's over, Mason said quietly. Stay away from my wife. This isn't finished. Yes, it is. I've left records with the U.S. Marshal's office about your business practices. Touch us, and federal marshals will swarm this territory. For the first time in years, Blackwood looked genuinely worried. Mason rode home to find Elizabeth waiting. When she saw him unharmed, she ran into his arms. Thank God you're safe. It's over. We're free. Over the following weeks, what began as convenience transformed into something deeper. They learned each other's habits. Physical distance gradually decreased. The turning point came a month later. Elizabeth had been feeling unwell. When Dr. Henderson confirmed her suspicions, she sat processing the news. What did the doctor say? Mason asked anxiously. I'm pregnant. Mason stared in shock. But we haven't. It happened before. The night before the wedding that never was. Blackwood. Mason understood, his face going white with rage. Why didn't you tell me? I was afraid you'd send me away. Mason stepped closer, taking her hands. This child will be our child. Mine and yours. Elizabeth burst into tears. Mason held her as she cried. I love you, she whispered. I started falling in love with you that first day. I love you too. More than I ever thought possible. That night, they shared the bed as husband and wife in every sense. 8 months later, Elizabeth gave birth to a healthy daughter with Mason's blue eyes. They named her Sarah. Years passed. They had 2 more children. The ranch prospered. Mason's reputation grew stronger. Blackwood kept his distance, eventually moving north where he died of a heart attack. Elizabeth never regretted running from that wedding or choosing Mason. She'd found genuine love with a man who valued her for who she was. Mason never regretted protecting a frightened woman. She'd brought joy back to his life, given him a family and future. On quiet evenings, watching desert sunsets, they'd talk about that day in Murphy's saloon, when their lives changed forever. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been chasing the Fletcher gang every day? But some things are meant to be. Maybe it was fate. Years later, they'd tell their story to grandchildren, of when the West was wild, and when love could bloom in unlikely places. Their marriage, which began as a desperate bargain, became a love story that inspired everyone. They proved the strongest foundations aren't always passion. Sometimes they're built on respect and shared values. Every anniversary, Mason brought Elizabeth desert wildflowers, hardy blooms that thrived in impossible conditions, just like their love. If this story touched your heart, reminded you that true love can bloom in unexpected places, and survive the greatest challenges, you're in the right place. At Western Love Stories, we believe the greatest romances aren't the easiest ones. They're fought for, earned through courage and sacrifice. Mason and Elizabeth's story shows us that sometimes powerful love stories begin, not with passion, but with protection, not with desire, but with decency. Subscribe to Western Love Stories. For more tales of love that conquered the frontier, hearts that found each other across impossible odds. Because in the American West, love wasn't just an emotion, it was an act of courage. And these stories prove that courage, like love, never goes out of style.